The encounter at Oakwood Park. Oakwood Park had always been Karen Whitfield's sanctuary, a pristine suburban haven where she could escape the stress of her life. At 45, she was the picture of suburban privilege, impeccably dressed in designer workout gear, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her days filled with activities that reflected her status in the community. But as she walked the familiar path one sunny morning, her peace was shattered by the sight of a man occupying the very bench where she liked to sit and enjoy the view of the duck pond. Karen's steps slowed as she approached. Her carefully applied lipstick seemed to thin into a sharp line as her lips pressed together in disapproval. The man, his appearance disheveled, with a faded military jacket and worn-out boots, was clearly homeless. His deep brown skin, marked with the weariness of hardship, was the final detail that sent a wave of indignation through her. In Karen's mind, this park was a reflection of her pristine life, and this man didn't fit. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You can't sleep here." The man, startled from a light sleep, blinked his tired eyes. Slowly, he sat up, rubbing his face. Karen took a small step back, her hand instinctively clutching her expensive purse. The man's weathered face softened as he looked at her, and his voice came out low and raspy. "I'm sorry, man," he said gently. "I didn't mean to bother anyone. I'll move on." For a moment, there was a flicker of something in Karen's heart, a tiny whisper of compassion. But it was drowned out by her simmering resentment and misplaced anger. This man, with his unkempt appearance, reminded her too much of the chaos in her own life, the mess she had fought so hard to escape. Instead of empathy, Karen felt disgust, and her next words came out harsher than she intended. "You're making people uncomfortable. This is a nice neighborhood, and we don't need people like you hanging around. Move along now." The man's shoulders slumped, but he didn't protest. He gathered his few belongings, a worn backpack, a jacket that had seen better days, and a tattered photograph he carefully placed in his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with the exhaustion of someone who had faced rejection more times than they could count. As the man stood to leave, Karen's sense of righteousness swelled. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was filled with false concern as she reported him to the authorities. "There's a suspicious man here at Oakwood Park," Karen said, casting a sideways glance at the man, as if he were already guilty of some unspeakable crime. "He's loitering and acting aggressively. I don't feel safe." The man, whose name was John Williams, stood silently, overhearing every word. He had grown used to this. People calling the police, assuming the worst because of his appearance. But this time, something inside him snapped. He had served his country, risked his life for the very people who now feared him, and yet here he was, homeless, alone, and being treated like a criminal in the country he had once defended. But John didn't say a word. He simply waited for the inevitable. Around them, a few passers-by stopped to watch the scene unfold. An elderly man feeding the ducks glanced up with disapproval, and a young mother pushing her stroller slowed down, her face etched with concern. Yet no one intervened. As John stood there, waiting for the police to arrive, he felt a strange calm wash over him. This wasn't the first time he had been in a situation like this, but it was the first time he truly questioned how he had ended up here. A veteran, once proud and full of hope, now reduced to this. The man he had once been felt like a distant memory. When the police arrived, two officers, one young and fresh-faced, the other older and grizzled, approached. Karen, emboldened by their presence, hurried toward them, her voice filled with self-righteous indignation. "There he is. He's been loitering here, making me and everyone else feel unsafe," she said, waving her hand toward John. The older officer glanced at John, his eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the way John carried himself, the quiet dignity in his stance despite his worn clothes, made him pause. "Sir, do you have any identification on you?" The older officer asked, his tone calm but firm. John nodded and slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his military ID. He handed it to the officer without a word. The officer took a moment to examine it, his expression softening as he read the name. John Williams, U.S. Army veteran. Karen watched, her smug smile faltering as the officer's demeanor changed. She had expected them to drag this man away, but instead, the officer handed the ID back to John with a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Williams," the officer said quietly. Karen's face twisted in confusion. "What? You're just going to let him stay here?" The older officer turned to Karen, his gaze stern. "Ma'am, this man served our country. He's not breaking any laws by sitting on a bench in a public park." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was used to getting her way, to people bending to her will. But here, in this moment, she was powerless. The younger officer stepped forward, his expression filled with curiosity. "Mr. Williams, is there anything we can do to help you?" John shook his head, his voice quiet. "No, thank you. I'll be on my way." But the older officer wasn't ready to let him walk away just yet. There was something in John's eyes, something that told a deeper story, a story that went beyond homelessness, beyond his present circumstances, and for reasons the officer couldn't quite explain, he felt compelled to help. As Karen watched in disbelief, the two officers engaged John in a conversation, one that would set in motion a chain of events neither she nor John could have predicted, a conversation that, over time, would lead to a journey of redemption, understanding, and ultimately, an unexpected transformation that would change both of their lives forever. The unlikely connection. The encounter at Oakwood Park could have ended there, with John Williams walking away and Karen Whitfield continuing her life, unchanged. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. John gathered his few belongings and started to walk toward the edge of the park, his worn boots scuffing the gravel as he went. The younger officer, Officer Davis, couldn't shake the sense that this man had a story, one that he wasn't ready to let end with just a simple exchange. "Mr. Williams," Officer Davis called after him, jogging up to meet John. "Wait a second. Do you have anywhere to go?" John turned slowly, his face a mixture of surprise and hesitation. He had been asked that question many times before, and the answer was always the same. "I'll find somewhere," he said, his voice steady, though he knew the truth was far less certain. Oakwood Park had been his refuge for the past few weeks, a temporary home where he could at least rest without constant harassment. But Karen's confrontation had shattered that fragile peace. Officer Davis frowned, clearly not satisfied with John's answer. "Look, I know it's tough out here. I have a cousin who runs a shelter a few blocks from here. It's not much, but they have hot meals and a place to sleep. I can give you a ride if you'd like." John's instinct was to refuse. He had learned over the years to rely on no one but himself. The last time he had trusted anyone, it had led to disappointment and heartache. But there was something genuine in the young officer's offer, something that John hadn't encountered in a long time. Reluctantly, he nodded. "I'd appreciate that," John said quietly. Officer Davis radioed his partner, and soon enough, the squad car was rolling toward the nearby shelter. In the back seat, John sat silently, gazing out the window as the city passed by in a blur of colors and faces. He didn't often get the chance to ride in cars anymore, and the simple act of sitting in the back of a police cruiser made his stomach churn. He was a veteran, but now he was no different from any other homeless man the world forgot about. As they drove, Davis glanced in the rearview mirror, studying John. He wanted to ask so many questions but wasn't sure where to start. Something about this man reminded him of his own father, who had also served in the military. Davis had grown up hearing stories of bravery and sacrifice, but also of how hard it was for veterans to adjust to life after the war. Davis could tell that John's battle scars went deeper than what could be seen on the surface. "How long have you been on the streets, Mr. Williams?" Davis finally asked, his voice gentle, more like a friend than a cop. John didn't answer right away. He shifted in his seat, looking down at his weathered hands. Off and on for the last few years, he said after a long pause. I tried to keep things together after I left the service, but he trailed off, the weight of those unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. Davis waited, sensing that John was on the verge of opening up. But John remained quiet, his thoughts buried too deep for a casual conversation. The ride ended in front of a nondescript brick building with a faded sign that read Hope Haven Shelter. It wasn't much to look at, but the smell of cooking food wafted from the open door, and a few people gathered outside exchanged quiet greetings. Davis parked the cruiser and got out, opening the back door for John. Here we are, Davis said. It's not fancy, but it's safe. If you ever need anything, just let me know. John nodded his thanks and stepped out of the car, gripping his tattered backpack tightly. As he walked toward the shelter entrance, he felt the familiar pang of uncertainty. This was just another stop in his endless journey, and he wasn't sure how long it would last. Meanwhile, back at Oakwood Park, Karen Whitfield was still fuming. She couldn't believe how the police had treated her, as if she were the one in the wrong. How dare they take that man's side? He was clearly loitering, and now she was the one being judged by the officers and even the other parkgoers. It was infuriating. She stomped back to her luxury SUV, feeling the need to vent to someone, anyone, who would listen. Her fingers flew across her phone screen as she called her friend Denise. You would not believe what just happened, Karen began as soon as Denise picked up. There was this homeless man. No, worse, a homeless veteran, taking up space in the park, making everyone uncomfortable, and the police just let him go. Can you believe that? Denise was used to Karen's rants, and while she usually indulged her, today she seemed unusually quiet. Karen went on, oblivious to her friend's growing discomfort. You know, they act like we're supposed to feel sorry for them, Karen continued, her voice rising with indignation. But honestly, it's their own fault. They should have planned better. If he's a veteran, then why doesn't he have some kind of benefits? Why is he homeless? Finally, Denise interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Karen, have you ever actually talked to someone who's homeless? Do you even know what they've been through? Karen was taken aback. What are you saying? I'm just stating facts. People need to take responsibility for their own lives. Denise sighed. Karen, not everyone has the privileges we do. Just because someone is homeless doesn't mean they didn't try. Life is harder for some people, and sometimes it's not about poor choices. It's about circumstances. Maybe instead of judging, we should try to understand. Karen rolled her eyes, though deep down, Denise's words struck a chord. But she wasn't ready to admit that yet. Whatever, Karen muttered, her frustration mounting. I don't need a lecture. They ended the call on a sour note, but as Karen drove away from the park, something Denise had said lingered in her mind. Have you ever actually talked to someone who's homeless? It was a question Karen didn't want to face, because the answer was no. She had never taken the time to understand the lives of people like John Williams. To her, they were just a problem, an eyesore in her otherwise perfect world. But now she couldn't stop thinking about him. Meanwhile, at the shelter, John was settling in for the night. The bed was basic but clean, and the warm meal he'd been given felt like a luxury. As he lay down, staring at the cracked ceiling, his thoughts drifted back to the park and the woman who had called the police on him. He didn't hate her. He had encountered too many people like her over the years. People who were quick to judge but slow to understand. Still, something about that encounter felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. Neither John nor Karen knew it yet, but their paths were far from finished crossing. In the days to come, a series of unexpected events would unfold, forcing both of them to confront their deepest fears, regrets, and assumptions. And in the process, they would discover that redemption and transformation can come from the most unlikely of places. A glimpse of humanity. The days following the encounter in Oakwood Park were quiet for both Karen and John, but beneath the surface, ripples of that fateful morning were starting to affect them in ways neither could anticipate. For John, life at the shelter was a mixed blessing. He had a place to sleep, 3 square meals, and the relative safety of being indoors. It was more than he had allowed himself to hope for after years of bouncing between homelessness and temporary shelters. But something still gnawed at him. The feeling that his life had drifted so far from the man he used to be, that he might never regain the dignity he once knew. As he settled into the routine of the shelter, John found himself thinking about Oakwood Park, not because of the confrontation, but because of the woman, Karen. Her face, with its cold contempt, lingered in his memory, but not in the way he expected. He had faced prejudice, hatred, and disdain countless times since his life had taken a turn for the worse. But Karen had seemed different, in a way he couldn't explain. She didn't strike him as inherently cruel. Misguided, yes, but not beyond redemption. He thought about the way she clutched her designer purse, as if his mere presence was a threat to her comfort, and he wondered what had shaped her to see the world in such stark terms. That evening, after dinner, John found himself sitting with a few of the other veterans who frequented the shelter. They were a mixed group from all branches of the military, each with their own stories of hardship and survival. Some had served in Vietnam, others in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they all shared the same bond of having seen too much, felt too much, and struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. "That woman in the park," John finally said, breaking the comfortable silence they had all been sitting in. "She called the cops on me. Thought I was a threat just for sitting on a bench." One of the men, a Marine named Rodriguez, shook his head and laughed bitterly. "Man, that's the story of our lives, isn't it? We fight for this country, come back, and suddenly, we're the enemy. People like her, they don't know what it's like. Never had to fight for anything in their lives." John nodded, but he felt a little unsettled by the conversation. Something in Rodriguez's tone struck him as too final, too resigned. John didn't want to believe that people like Karen were beyond reaching, that they were forever trapped in their ignorance. But what could he do? He was just a man trying to survive another day, not someone who could change hearts and minds. "I don't think she's all bad," John said quietly. "She looked scared more than anything. Scared of what I represented. I don't know. Maybe she's never had to face something like this before." Rodriguez snorted. "You're too kind, Williams. People like that don't change. They see us as less than human. And that's never gonna change." The conversation died down after that, but John's mind kept turning over the idea that people could change, that there was something deeper going on beneath the surface of that encounter in the park. He didn't know why, but a part of him wasn't ready to give up on Karen, not yet. Meanwhile, Karen's life was continuing as usual, but she found herself increasingly distracted. The incident at the park had left a mark on her that she didn't want to admit, even to herself. The ease with which she had called the police, the way she had assumed the worst about John. It all felt so natural in the moment. But now, in the quiet of her home, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that maybe she had been wrong. Denise's words echoed in her mind. "Have you ever actually talked to someone who's homeless?" That question haunted her. The truth was, she hadn't. She had never taken the time to see them as anything other than a nuisance. They were problems to be solved, not people with stories. And yet, something about John's face, the weariness in his eyes, the way he didn't argue, didn't defend himself, kept resurfacing in her thoughts. One afternoon, as Karen was driving home from a yoga class, she found herself taking the detour, almost unconsciously, back to Oakwood Park, the place where it had all happened. She parked her car and walked the familiar path, her designer sneakers once again crunching on the gravel. But this time, she wasn't looking for the best spot by the duck pond. She found herself scanning the benches, as if expecting to see John sitting there again. But of course, he wasn't. Instead, she saw families playing, joggers passing by, and elderly couples strolling hand in hand. It was the same park, but it felt different to her now, as if a veil had been lifted, and she was seeing it for the first time. As she walked, she noticed the looks other people gave her, some curious, others indifferent. But it struck her how little she had ever paid attention to the people around her. She had always been so focused on her own world, her own bubble, that she had never truly seen anyone else. Karen sat down on the same bench John had occupied that day, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself think. Really think. She thought about her own life, her own struggles. Growing up, she had fought hard to escape the chaos of her dysfunctional family. She had worked tirelessly to create a life that was polished, controlled, and perfect, at least on the outside. But the truth was, she had always carried a sense of fear and insecurity deep within her, a fear of losing control, of slipping back into the chaos she had once known. And now she realized that when she had seen John, disheveled and homeless, it wasn't just his appearance that had triggered her anger. It was the fear that she could so easily end up like him. The fear that everything she had built could crumble, and she would be left with nothing. But what right did she have to project her own fears onto him? What right did she have to assume that his life had been one of failure, that he hadn't tried, that he wasn't worthy of dignity and respect? Karen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel something other than contempt or fear. She allowed herself to feel empathy. Maybe Denise was right, she thought. Maybe I've been wrong about all of this. Suddenly, Karen felt a resolve forming inside her. She didn't know what she could do, or how she could fix the mistakes she had made, but she knew she needed to do something. She couldn't just go back to her old life and pretend nothing had happened. She couldn't ignore the fact that she had judged John unfairly, and that there were countless others like him who deserved better than what she had given them. Karen stood up from the bench, her mind racing with ideas. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, she would begin with finding John. As the days passed, Karen began making small changes in her life. She started volunteering at a local soup kitchen, not because she wanted to feel better about herself, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. She began reading about the struggles of veterans and the challenges of homelessness. She reached out to organizations that provided support to people like John, hoping to learn more about how she could help. But despite her efforts, one question still lingered. Where was John? Karen hadn't seen him since that day at the park, and as much as she wanted to apologize, to make amends, she didn't know how to find him. She felt as though she had been given a second chance, but without John, that chance felt incomplete. Then, one afternoon, as Karen was leaving the soup kitchen after her volunteer shift, she saw him. John was standing at the corner of the street, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder, looking just as tired and weathered as she remembered. Her heart raced as she watched him cross the street, heading in her direction. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Karen took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face him, ready to say the words that had been building inside her for weeks. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized that her apology, while important, was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would require far more than just words. Because what Karen and John didn't yet know was that their lives were about to become intertwined in ways neither of them could have imagined. The first step toward change. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching as John Williams approached. Her heart thudded in her chest, her mind racing with the words she wanted to say. She had spent days, weeks even, thinking about this moment, about how she would apologize and try to make things right. But now that he was here, only a few feet away, all those carefully rehearsed speeches seemed to vanish into thin air. John didn't notice her at first. His eyes were focused on the ground, his gait slow and heavy, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Karen's chest tightened. She had seen that kind of wariness before, not in the homeless people she had encountered, but in her own reflection. The years of fighting to hold everything together, to present a perfect life to the world, had left her just as tired, just as burdened. It was only now, after all these weeks of reflection, that she truly understood how much they had in common. Summoning all her courage, Karen took a step forward and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "John." He stopped in his tracks and looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. It took a moment for recognition to dawn on his face, and when it did, his expression hardened. Karen felt a pang of guilt deep in her stomach, but she refused to turn away. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. "John, she faltered, her words catching in her throat. "I'm sorry." For a long moment, John just stared at her, his eyes unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "What do you want?" His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was guarded, as though he had already prepared himself for disappointment. Karen swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. I want to apologize," she said, her words rushing out in a flood. "For what I said in the park, for how I treated you. It wasn't right, and I know that now. I've been thinking about it ever since, and I realize how wrong I was. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and that's not fair." John's face remained impassive, but Karen could see the flicker of something, surprise, maybe, or disbelief, pass through his eyes. He didn't respond right away, and Karen feared she had lost him before she even had a chance to explain. "I've been trying to understand," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been volunteering at the soup kitchen, and I've learned a lot about what people go through. But I know that doesn't change what happened. I just wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry." John stood in silence for a long time, his eyes searching her face. Karen shifted nervously, unsure of what to expect. She had prepared herself for anger, for rejection, but the silence was almost worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I've heard a lot of apologies in my time," he said quietly. "People feel bad for a while. Then they go back to their lives and forget all about it. What makes you different?" The question hit Karen like a punch to the gut. She hadn't expected him to forgive her so easily, but his words cut deeper than she anticipated. For a moment, she was tempted to retreat, to tell herself that she had done enough by apologizing. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She hadn't come here for absolution. She had come because she needed to make a real change, not just for John, but for herself. "I don't know what makes me different," Karen admitted, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "But I don't want to go back to the way I was. I want to do better. I want to understand more, to help more. I don't expect you to believe me, but I'm trying, John. I really am." John's expression softened just a fraction, but his eyes were still filled with skepticism. He had been let down too many times by people who promised to help, only to disappear when it mattered most. He wasn't about to trust Karen, not after one conversation. But there was something in her voice, a desperation, perhaps, that made him pause. "Trying, huh?" John said, his voice softer now, but still guarded. "And what exactly are you trying to do?" Karen exhaled slowly, relieved that he hadn't walked away yet. "I don't know," she admitted, her honesty surprising even herself. "I don't have all the answers. I just know that I can't pretend anymore. I can't act like people like you don't exist. And I can't live with the way I treated you." John stared at her for a moment longer, then glanced away, as if weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Words are easy," he said. "Action is harder." Karen nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. Words alone wouldn't be enough to make up for what had happened. She needed to prove, through her actions, that she was serious about change. "I understand," Karen said quietly, "and I'm willing to take action. But I don't know where to start. Maybe you can help me understand," John raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her request. He had expected her to give up after a half-hearted apology, to move on with her life and forget about him, like so many others had done before. But this was unexpected. "Help you?" John repeated, his tone incredulous. "You want me to help you?" Karen nodded, her heart in her throat. "Yes," she said. "I don't know how to fix this or how to make things right, but I want to learn. I want to understand what people like you go through, what I've been blind to all this time. I'm asking for your help because I know I can't do it alone." John's face softened slightly, but there was still wariness in his eyes. He had heard too many promises, seen too many good intentions crumble under the weight of reality. But something about Karen's plea struck a chord in him. It wasn't pity or guilt that motivated her. It was something deeper, something real. For the first time in years, John felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Hope. "I don't know if I can help you," John said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm just trying to survive out here, like everyone else." Karen's heart sank, but she nodded in understanding. She knew this wouldn't be easy, that John had no obligation to help her. But even so, she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I understand," she said softly. "But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. I want to listen." John didn't respond right away, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps, that gave Karen a small glimmer of hope. He hadn't completely shut her out, and that was more than she could have hoped for. As John turned to leave, Karen watched him walk away, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation. She knew that this was only the beginning, that there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose, a determination to make things right, not just with John, but with herself. In the days that followed, Karen threw herself into her newfound mission, with more determination than ever. She continued volunteering at the soup kitchen, learning more about the struggles of those who lived on the margins of society. She reached out to local organizations that worked with veterans, offering her time and resources to help in any way she could. And through it all, she kept thinking about John. She didn't see him again for a while, but she hadn't given up hope. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight, that it would take time, patience, and perseverance. But Karen was willing to wait, willing to prove through her actions that she was serious about making a difference. One afternoon, as Karen was leaving the soup kitchen after another long shift, she saw him again. John was standing across the street, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder, watching her with a thoughtful expression. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to fall into place. Karen crossed the street and approached him, her heart racing. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if he would even be willing to talk. But as she stood before him, John spoke first. "Let's walk," he said simply. Karen nodded, her heart soaring with hope. This was it, the first step toward something new, something real. As they walked together through the streets of the city, neither of them knew exactly where this journey would lead, but both of them understood one thing. Sometimes, the hardest part of change isn't the apology. It's the willingness to keep going, to keep trying, even when the path is uncertain. The road to redemption. As Karen and John walked side by side through the busy streets, the silence between them was filled with unspoken thoughts and unresolved tension. Karen could feel the weight of John's presence next to her, his quiet dignity mixed with an underlying wariness that made every step feel delicate. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Trust was something that had to be earned, not requested. But this was a start. They didn't walk toward any particular destination. Instead, they moved in tandem, following the winding streets of the city, passing small shops and bustling markets. The city seemed to hum with life around them. The sound of car horns, distant chatter, and the occasional shout from a street vendor punctuating the quiet between them. Despite the noise, Karen's focus was on John. She wanted to hear his story, to understand what had brought him to this point in his life. But she didn't want to push him. If he was going to open up, it had to be on his terms. After what felt like hours, John finally spoke, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I don't know what you expect to get out of this," he said quietly, not looking at her. His gaze remained fixed ahead, on the cracks in the pavement, as if they held the answers to the unasked questions hanging in the air. "People like you, they think they can fix everything with good intentions. But I'm not some project for you to feel good about yourself." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She had been prepared for his skepticism, even his anger, but hearing it still stung. She had to remind herself that this wasn't about her, that John's wariness came from a lifetime of being let down, of being treated as invisible or as a problem to be solved. She had to prove to him, and to herself, that this time would be different. "I don't see you as a project, John," Karen said softly, her voice steady. "I see you as a person who's been through things I can't even imagine. And you're right, I've been selfish. For a long time, I've lived in my own little bubble, and I never thought about what other people were going through. I don't expect you to forgive me for that, and I don't expect to fix anything overnight. I want to try." John was quiet for a moment, his footsteps slowing slightly as he processed her words. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable, and then looked away again. "You want to try," he repeated, as though testing the weight of her words. "What does that even mean?" Karen paused, choosing her next words carefully. "It means I'm not going to walk away this time. It means I'm here to listen, to learn. And if there's anything I can do to help, not just you, but others like you, I want to do that. I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to learn from you, from your experiences." John's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment, Karen worried she had said the wrong thing. But then, to her surprise, John let out a small, quiet laugh, one tinged with a mix of disbelief and something else she couldn't quite place. "You want to learn from me?" he asked, shaking his head. "I don't know what you think I can teach you. My life's not some inspirational story." Karen stopped walking and turned to face him. "I don't need an inspirational story," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I need the truth." John stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face for any hint of insincerity. When he found none, he sighed, his shoulders relaxing just a little. He gestured to a nearby bench, one that sat in the shade of a large oak tree, and without a word, they both sat down. For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching the world go by. Karen didn't push. She simply waited, sensing that John needed to gather his thoughts before he could speak. Finally, John broke the silence. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Here's the truth." He looked out across the street, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the bustling city before them. "I didn't always live like this," he began. "I had a life. A good life. Or at least I thought it was. I served in the army for 20 years. It wasn't easy, but it gave me purpose. I had a family, my wife, Angela, and my daughter, Layla. They were my world." His voice softened as he spoke about them, and Karen could hear the love and loss in his words. She remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "When I retired from the army, I thought I'd be able to settle down, be the husband and father they deserved. But things didn't go the way I planned. I came back from my last deployment. Different. The things I saw over there, the things I had to do, they changed me. I had nightmares, flashbacks. I tried to hide it, tried to keep it together for Angela and Layla, but I was slipping and I didn't know how to stop it." Karen listened intently, her heart aching for him. She had never imagined the depths of his struggle, the trauma he had carried with him all these years. "I didn't want to ask for help," John continued, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought I could handle it, but I started drinking, trying to drown out the memories. Angela tried to help me, but I pushed her away. I didn't want her to see how broken I was. Eventually, she left, took Layla with her. I don't blame her. She deserved better. He paused, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. Karen could see the tension in his posture, the weight of the memories he was reliving. After they left, I lost everything, John said quietly. The house, the job, everything. I ended up on the streets, just another homeless vet people pretend not to see. I tried to get help from the VA, but the system is broken. There are too many of us, and not enough resources. I couldn't navigate the red tape, and before I knew it, I was out here, surviving day to day. Karen felt a lump in her throat as she listened to his story. This wasn't the life John had chosen. It was the life he had been forced into, a life shaped by trauma and a broken system that had failed him. She wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but she knew that words alone couldn't heal the wounds he carried. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "I had no idea. I never even thought about what veterans go through after they come home." John shrugged, his expression resigned. "Most people don't. It's easier to look away, to pretend we're not here." Karen swallowed hard, the weight of her own ignorance pressing down on her. She had been one of those people, turning a blind eye, judging from a distance, never once considering the struggles that people like John faced. And now, sitting here beside him, she felt the full force of that realization. But this wasn't about her guilt. This was about finding a way forward, together. "John," Karen said after a moment, "I don't know how to make this right. I can't change the past, and I can't fix everything that's gone wrong. But I want to help however I can. I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem." John glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what do you think you can do?" Karen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She had been thinking about this for weeks, trying to figure out how to turn her desire to help into concrete action. And now, sitting here with John, the answer seemed clearer than ever. "I've been volunteering at the soup kitchen," she said, "but I want to do more. I've been talking to some organizations that work with veterans, and I think there's a way to bring more attention to the issues you faced. The lack of support, the red tape, the mental health challenges. I have connections in the community. I know people who can help. I want to start something. A program, maybe, or a fundraiser, to make sure veterans like you get the support you deserve." John didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering whether or not to believe in her promise. Karen held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Finally, John sighed and leaned back on the bench, his eyes closing briefly as if he was exhausted from the weight of his own story. "People have made promises before," he said quietly. "They talk big, but when it comes time to actually do something, they disappear. I'm not saying you're like them, but I've learned not to get my hopes up." Karen nodded, understanding his skepticism. "I get it, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm committed to this." John opened his eyes and looked at her, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you care so much? You don't owe me anything." Karen took a deep breath, her voice filled with sincerity. "Because I was wrong, and because I've spent my whole life living in a world that's been blind to people like you. I don't want to be blind anymore." For the first time since they had met, John smiled. A small, fleeting smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Well," he said softly, "I guess we'll see, won't we?" Karen smiled back, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning she was willing to fight for. As they sat together on that bench, two people from completely different worlds, Karen realized that this journey wasn't just about helping John. It was about redemption, hers and his. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path. The ripple of redemption. Months had passed since Karen and John's fateful conversation on the park bench. What had begun as a simple apology had evolved into something far deeper, a commitment to change, not only for Karen, but for both of them. Their journey had been marked by moments of progress and setbacks, But through it all, something remarkable had started to take shape. A partnership built on trust, mutual understanding, and the shared goal of making a difference. Karen had kept her promise. She threw herself into her new mission, working tirelessly to bring attention to the struggles of veterans like John. It hadn't been easy. The world wasn't exactly waiting to hear from her. Just another wealthy suburban woman with a sudden urge to give back. But Karen was relentless. She knocked on doors, attended community meetings, and even used her connections from her previous life to get her foot in the door of influential circles. Slowly but surely, she began to build momentum. Her first breakthrough came when she convinced a local news station to cover John's story. It wasn't just a story about a homeless veteran. It was a story about resilience, redemption, and the failures of a system that had left men like John behind. Karen had worried about how John would react to the spotlight, but to her surprise, he had agreed. "I'm tired of being invisible," he had said. "If this helps someone else, then it's worth it." The news segment aired on a chilly October evening, and the response was immediate. Emails and phone calls flooded in, some from people who had no idea veterans faced such obstacles after serving their country, others from veterans who saw themselves in John's story and felt, for the first time, that their struggles were being acknowledged. For Karen, it was a validation of everything she had worked for, but it was only the beginning. John, meanwhile, had undergone his own transformation. The man who had once sat on a park bench, tired and broken, now stood taller, more confident. He still had his bad days, the memories of his time in the army, the loss of his family, and the years he had spent homeless didn't just disappear, but he had started to find purpose again. Through Karen's efforts, John had connected with a group that provided job training and mental health support for veterans. He had been skeptical at first, but with Karen's encouragement, he attended their workshops and counseling sessions. One day, after months of hard work, John was offered a job at a local nonprofit that helped veterans transition back into civilian life. It wasn't just any job. It was one where John could use his own experiences to help others. His role was to provide peer support, mentoring other veterans who were struggling to adjust, just as he had once struggled. The first time John stood in front of a group of veterans, telling his story, he had felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing, but as he looked around the room and saw the faces of men and women who had walked a similar path, he realized that his story mattered. His voice mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with survival. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about giving back, about using his pain and his journey to help others find their way. And with every life he touched, every veteran he helped navigate the maze of civilian life, John felt a little more whole. Karen and John's partnership had turned into something neither of them could have predicted. What began as an unlikely connection between two people from very different worlds had blossomed into a friendship built on trust, mutual respect, and the shared belief that change was possible. Together, they had started an initiative called Bridging the Gap, a program aimed at connecting veterans with the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. The program focused not only on providing practical support, such as housing assistance, job training, and mental health services, but also on fostering understanding between veterans and the broader community. Karen used her social connections and newfound passion to raise funds and awareness, while John took on the role of mentor and advocate. The program quickly gained traction, with local businesses offering job placements and the community rallying behind their cause. It wasn't long before other cities took notice, and soon, Bridging the Gap was being adopted in communities across the state. For Karen, the program had become more than just a project. It had become her life's work, a way to atone for the years she had spent ignoring the people around her, pretending that homelessness and suffering were problems that didn't affect her. She had come to understand that real change required more than just good intentions. It required sustained action, empathy, and above all, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the world and about oneself. Through her work with Bridging the Gap, Karen had met countless veterans, each with their own story of struggle and survival. She had come to realize that John's story, while unique, was not an anomaly. There were thousands of veterans just like him, living on the margins of society, forgotten and ignored. But now, through their program, those veterans had a voice. They had hope. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser, Karen and John sat together on the same park bench where their journey had begun. It was late, and the park was quiet, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the path. They had come here often in the months since they had first met, using this bench as a place to reflect on how far they had come. John leaned back, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" he said quietly. Karen smiled, nodding. "Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both of them lost in their thoughts. Then John spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You know, if you told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here with you, working on something like this, I wouldn't have believed you." Karen laughed softly. "I wouldn't have believed it either." John turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I never thank you, Karen. Not just for helping me, but for sticking with it. You didn't have to. Most people wouldn't have." Karen shook her head, her voice soft. "You don't have to thank me, John. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've taught me more than you know." John smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that Karen had come to treasure. "Well," he said, leaning back again, "I guess we both learned something then." As they sat there, watching the night settle over the park, Karen realized just how much her life had changed. She had once been so focused on maintaining the perfect facade, on keeping the world at arm's length. But now, she understood that true fulfillment came from connection. Real, messy, human connection. It came from caring about others, from putting in the work to make a difference, and from confronting the parts of herself that she had tried so hard to ignore. John had changed too. The man who had once seemed so closed off, so hardened by life's trials, was now a source of strength and hope for others. He had found a way to take his pain and turn it into something meaningful, something that gave others a chance at redemption, just as he had found his own. Months later, Karen stood in a packed auditorium, the room filled with people, veterans, their families, and supporters of the Bridging the Gap initiative. She had been asked to speak at a national conference on veteran support, and as she stepped up to the podium, she felt a wave of nervous energy wash over her. But then she looked out into the audience and saw John, sitting in the front row, giving her a small nod of encouragement. And with that, she knew she could do this. Taking a deep breath, Karen began to speak. "Good evening. My name is Karen Whitfield, and I stand before you today as someone who has learned that change is possible, for all of us. I'm here to tell you about a journey that began in a park, where I met a man who changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. That man is John Williams, a veteran who served this country with honor, but who was left behind by a system that failed him. And it was through meeting him that I realized how much I had to learn. About myself, about others, and about what it truly means to serve." She paused, her eyes scanning the room, and then continued, her voice strong and steady. Bridging the Gap was born out of that meeting. It was born out of the understanding that we are all connected, that the struggles of one person affect us all, and that it is our responsibility to lift each other up. Today our program is helping veterans across the country rebuild their lives, and it is because of people like John that we are making a difference. Karen glanced at John again, her heart swelling with gratitude. "This isn't just about helping veterans," she said. "It's about redemption. It's about seeing the humanity in one another and realizing that, no matter where we come from or what we've been through, we all deserve a second chance." The room erupted into applause, but Karen's eyes were fixed on John. He smiled at her, and in that moment, Karen knew that their journey wasn't over. it was only just beginning. Together, they had set something in motion, a ripple of change that would continue to spread, touching lives they couldn't even imagine. And as they stood side by side, Karen and John knew that they had found something far more valuable than they had ever expected.